All right. Well, welcome to the Cutrone Zone again. I'm Douglas Lane, the co-host of the Cutrone Zone, author of the short story Noam Chomsky and the Time Box, amongst other things. With me, of course, is resident genius, the last Marxist, track coach, shaman, strategist, and
Sage philosopher.
yeah, sage philosopher, scapegoat. I'm going to add
Scapegoat.
on. Yeah,
Scapegoat.
Chris Cutrone. Hey, Chris. The war is still going on. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing, Chris. It's going to end it all. This they didn't know. They had no plan. This is a complete debacle. Iran is winning. The U.S. empire is going to collapse. We are headed off the side of a cliff. This will make up for what happened in Gaza, and so on and so forth. Where do you stand?
Oh boy. Okay, so I mean, give war a chance.
Yeah.
No, this is I'm quoting Doug Henwood, Lisa Featherstone, and Christian Parenti. They
Uh-huh.
wrote an article called "Action Will Be Taken" in 2003, in which they cited Adorno's 1969 essay "Resignation" to criticize the anti-war movement. Right.
Mhm.
So it was one of the things that authorized Platypus, to my mind. So there were several things written and published in that time, 2003, 2004, 2005,
Mhm.
2006, that, before Platypus started, that authorized my taking on board the student demand that I do something extracurricular with them.
Mhm.
And that was one, Doug Henwood, Lisa Featherstone, there are a couple, and then Christian Parenti, who's been in the news more recently.
Mhm.
He published in Compact the left case for Kash Patel as director of the FBI.
Right, right.
This morning, by the way, before this, I was watching Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, and John Radcliffe, who's the CIA director, testify
Mhm.
in the Senate.
Right.
To prepare myself for, what the talking
Mhm.
points are. And it seems that has something to do with Joe Kent, who was an assistant to Tulsi Gabbard, resigning in protest of the war and complaining that it was driven by Israel. And I think that his resignation was probably timed to this hearing that had been scheduled. Right.
Right.
So anyway, but give war a chance. They were Henwood, Parenti, Featherstone. They were looking at like the anti-war protests, both after the invasion of Afghanistan, so when
Mhm.
it was still kind of small, but then building up to the Iraq War, pre-invasion, and they spotted a kind of, because these things are carnivalesque, these protests,
Mhm.
and they
Mhm.
spotted a sign that said "Give war a chance."
Right.
And they quoted it in their article. um, so the other articles that I'll mention that authorized Platypus were, of course, Moishe Pustone's History and Helplessness, which is kind of
Mhm.
notorious now, but I want to talk about some aspects of that. Um, he had another piece called Brenner, Origi, Harvey,
Mhm.
Theorizing the Contemporary World, about the sort of Marxist theorists of globalization and its discontents.
Mhm.
But there was Fred Halliday with Danny Postal. I don't know if you know who Danny Postal is.
I think I've heard the name.
Yeah, you've heard of him. So who was responsible? Right. And Fred Halliday had been an editor and a major contributor of the New Left Review, but had a falling out with Tariq Ali over the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan,
Mhm.
among other things. And basically, who was responsible, meaning, are we just going to lay the blame for everything going wrong in the world on US imperialism, right? Isn't there
Mhm.
any kind of responsibility for other actors in the world,
Mhm.
including on the left,
Mhm.
right? So these, indicated to me that there was a moment that older people, kind of mentor figures for the left, were signaling to the young people. And I thought that the young people were receptive to it. Let's rethink things. Let's not just rehearse the Vietnam anti war movement.
Right.
right? Let's really consider what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think that there is this bias, and something that we talked about last time about the two generations that are opposed to the war, the boomers and the millennials, because of their kind of generational trauma. The
Mm-hmm.
boomers with Vietnam and the millennials with the war on terror.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically these are compounding kind of historical memories where it's imagined that every war is going to replicate that experience. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
replicate Vietnam. It's going to replicate the war on terror. It's going to be. I was just watching Robert Pape, who's a professor at the University of Chicago on strategy. He was on Unheard, and he was talking about the escalation trap.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, I've been watching this kind of stuff. I didn't watch that one because I've heard it from Mearsheimer already. I've
Yeah,
heard it,
we know this story, right? This is
Yeah,
the
right.
story they've been telling. It's called the Vietnam syndrome. And now we have another syndrome, which is the Iraq War syndrome or
Mm-hmm.
the War on Terror syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think, well, that's assuming a lot of different things. That's assuming that the Islamic Republic is like the Vietnamese communists,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't think is a good assumption, right? I don't
Right.
think the Islamic Republic in 2026 has the legitimacy that the Vietnamese communists had in the 1960s.
Right. Oh no.
Oh, well, I mean, just a minor point, we
Yeah,
might
right.
say. And there
Yeah,
was go ahead.
right. I mean, look, that was one of the reasons why I had Monty on. Did
Hmm.
you see that
Yes,
interview
I
with
did.
Monty?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't agree with Monty overall about this,
Well, he
attack
has
on
a
Iran.
worldview. He has a kind of traumatized, Islamophobic worldview, we might
Yeah,
say, right?
yeah,
He's, the way we might be Christophobic
right. No, I mean,
from
I
being
totally
raised in a
understand. Like,
right,
I'm not mad at him for being that way, but
right.
he's embraced like Sam Harris. How seriously can I take his
A
worldview?
lot of leftists embrace Sam Harris, right?
Yeah,
It's the new
well,
atheism debate. And, Christopher
right.
Hitchens, he obviously,
Yeah,
Monty likes Christopher Hitchens.
right.
And I thought that Christopher Hitchens went a little bit overboard on like
Yeah.
the new atheism front, you know?
Oh
Um,
yeah.
right? I mean, that I think, right? I think
Yeah.
that in
Yeah.
that it's a little bit egregious. And certainly when it became part of the justification for supporting the war on terror,
Right. But
right?
just because I don't agree with Monty's worldview
Right.
doesn't mean I don't agree with Monty's desire for the Iranian people
Basic
to be
sentiment.
free of the regime.
Basic
Right.
sentiment, right?
Right. Right.
Because he was trying to get into, oh no, it's in Islam, it's in the Quran, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, there's all sorts of things in the Quran and in the Bible, and
Right. Right.
like
Right.
that can justify pretty much anything, and
Yeah.
these books can justify anything at all. They can
Right.
justify punishment, forgiveness,
Yeah.
like they can
Right.
they can justify LGBTQ, like
Yeah.
tolerance or throwing them off buildings, like you can
Right.
find whatever you want in the Bible or in the
Right.
Quran.
Mhm.
So, I mean, he was doing this kind of lame thing, which is like Muhammad's not a role model the way Jesus is. And it's like, yeah, I guess that's true. But how many Christians follow Jesus as a role model, really?
No.
You
Yeah.
know,
The whole
don't they?
point of it is that that's impossible to do. So.
It's impossible to do. And
Mhm.
anyway, don't they prefer the language of St. Paul and,
Mhm.
to Jesus's own language,
Yeah.
And then also Christians are of no problem, with the Old Testament. They'll just, when push comes to shove, they'll just invoke the Old Testament, and it's like, well, that was invalidated, the New Covenant,
Right.
right? But
Right.
no,
Right.
everybody forgets that.
Yeah.
So anyway, I thought that was a bit much, but no, I mean, obviously it's tricky. Like the genre of this Sublation media podcasting. You happen to know an Iranian,
Right.
right? And so you had him on the show. And then the predictable comments are, oh well, this is what expats are like, and you know and they
Mhm.
lose touch with their home country or whatever. And I'm like, they don't lose touch with their home country, but
Mhm.
yes, it is a biased sample, we could say. It's a
Yeah.
biased sample, okay?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Right. And also maybe this is not like the most politically sophisticated person.
Right. But let me say this. It's a biased sample because you showed up for an expansive realist workshop on his own without being recruited. Like I didn't make any effort to advertise. He just found out about it and showed up. In other words, he's attracted. He's part of the. He's one of us. He's a leftist. He's a red diaper baby.
Sure.
He's
sure.
You know, yeah.
Well, that was part of his animus as well.
Right.
Is that he was talking about how his family, the error that they made in the Islamic Revolution,
right,
of being
which is the most interesting thing for me was that.
That's the most interesting thing, and he's saying that the left always does this; it falls for this, and that is just generally true. So let's take a note of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I mentioned like Moïse Postone and Fred Halliday,
mm-hmm.
and and also with the Iraq War, it's Baathism, whereas now it's the Islamic Revolution. And so there is this history of the left subordinating itself first to nationalism,
mm-hmm.
and then to Islamism in the Middle East, in the Muslim world.
Yeah.
But in both cases, it didn't work out for them well. Meaning, in both cases, they got massacred by the people that they supported.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so they were massacred by Nasser and by Saddam Hussein, by the Baathists, by the Syrian Baathists. And then massacred by the Islamists in the Iranian Revolution.
Right.
Right. So this is and then of course there's Indonesia, right, where they supported the nationalists, but then ended up getting killed by the Islamists because the Islamists came out and helped the military. And I, by the way, I want to say something about this. Mossadegh, like I hear about the Mossadegh coup and kind of the mythology. We might say there's this mythology. There's an Iranian mythology. There definitely is, and you get it in the expat milieu as well. Not that Mani was voicing this, but he's certainly aware of it. I'm just here to say a couple of things. Mossadegh coup, like the Allende coup, these are domestic, indigenous things. These people would have been overthrown without the U.S. and the UK and the CIA. Let's just be clear about that. There was domestic opposition. They were overthrown by like popular discontents and the state, right? Like the state overthrew Mossadegh in Iran, and they did so out of anti-communism. And it's also because Mossadegh things were getting out of control. And similarly with Allende, meaning Allende was losing control of the situation, and the military stepped in and knocked him out. This is what happens. And something similar happened in Indonesia, where there was popular discontent, but there are state elements who get rid of the leader, overthrow the leader. And of course, like in the context of the Cold War, of course, the US is going to support getting rid of a pro-communist leader. Like that's just like granted, but it's not, it would have happened anyway. Right. So that's really the issue. And so, but again, the left, basically since the 1930s, has seen itself as supporting other forces out of anti-imperialism or decolonization or whatever. And it has not worked out. It's basically led to the complete liquidation. Now, you could say, oh, well, actually, maybe the left was already weak and liquidated, and that's what allowed it to be massacred. That's what allowed it to be done away with. And perhaps that's true. But nonetheless, that happens here also, right? So this is the thing that people hate, is that when we compare it to like the left supporting the Democrats or whatever, because it seems like, wait, what are you talking about? And also because people have this kind of very nationalistic and racialistic and culturalistic and civilizational kind of framework for understanding things, and turn it into, anti-imperialism, decolonization. And again, Fred Halliday and Danny Postol, who's responsible, meaning, and also Moïse Postone in History and Helplessness, shouldn't we care about the politics in these countries? The politics within these countries, like socialists, leftists, Marxists, communists. Like, I thought the whole point was class struggle, right? Class struggle happens within countries, not between countries, right? What about the fact that the capitalists of all countries are on one side and the workers of all countries should be on the other side? Right. Now, of course, the capitalists fall out with each other, and they kill each other, and they enlist us to help them kill each other.
Yeah. This is why I'm against war
Right,
generally, because I don't like people becoming cannon fodder for the capitalist state, whether it's here or in Iran or wherever. Like,
right,
so I oppose it. No war but class war.
right. And war, right, exactly. It's super tricky now because what you mentioned earlier isn't like Trump tearing down inadvertently, or maybe because he's a Manchurian candidate, Putin bot after all, tearing
Mhm.
down U.S. power through this war, right? That's going to undermine U.S. hegemony. And
I mean, I just don't see that being what's happening. But that's not, I don't see U.S. power declining in this moment. There are moments, so there are things that are happening that are not great for U.S. power, but overall, it doesn't look to me like this is a decline in U.S. power, but an exertion of it.
yeah,
I mean, and so it's yet to be seen how far the asymmetric strategies can go and how successful
yeah,
they'll be.
asymmetric warfare. I mean, that's the other
Mhm.
thing, is that people are obsessed with asymmetric warfare. And also this another myth from the era of the resistance, the anti-fascist, anti-Nazi resistance during World War II and after, and then decolonization struggles, which is that counterinsurgencies always fail. It's this kind
Mhm.
of heroic myth that counterinsurgencies always fail, that insurgencies always succeed. And that's just simply not true. Mostly
Right.
counterinsurgencies are successful.
Mhm.
So it's not, my husband is from Malaysia. They had a communist insurgency. It was suppressed.
Mhm.
You
We
know,
just saw in Iran the insurgency get suppressed,
yeah,
right?
the
I mean,
protest movement. The problem
right.
with the protest movement, I was just watching a Council of Foreign Relations roundtable discussion
Mhm.
on like the war and its possible outcomes, and strategy and whatnot, and the possibility of regime change and all this good stuff. And and obviously the problem is that the opposition in Iran is not organized sufficiently.
Right.
And that's just the reality of the situation. So a couple of things that Trump said, right?
Mhm.
So Trump was asked whether it's more like whether Cuba, right? It's in the Cuban context, whether it's going to be more like Venezuela or more like Iran. And he said, it could be either. It's up to them, right? So as far as he's concerned, Iran is a success because it's telling people, we'll do this to you,
Mhm.
right? Meaning, you know, uh, that they can do it and they will do it. The Robert Pape thing that I was watching about the escalation trap, and how he had predicted even before the bombs started dropping that go through these phases, and it's happening just as he predicted. Well, one basic thing that we need to understand is that Trump's still escalating,
Mhm.
right? So, and there is what I've mentioned previously, bourgeois defeatism,
Right.
and that's the problem, is that we're being fed a lot of bourgeois defeatism, and it's coming from the Democrats, it's coming from the foreign policy establishment, it's coming from market jitters, it's
Well,
coming
yeah.
from NATO, it's coming from the NATO allies, it's coming from whoever, right? But
Mhm.
this is the crazy fantasy that people have, because I've seen Mearsheimer articulate it, I've seen Vali Nasser, who's a commentator, articulate it, an Iranian expat political scientist. The fantasy, are you ready for this, Doug?
Mhm.
The US is losing, and the point is to cut its losses. And what they imagine is going to happen, they imagine that the US is going to be pushed out of the Persian Gulf. And
Mearsheimer does?
yes, and he thinks that the US is going to be forced to pay reparations to Iran. No,
No.
right. Yes, he said
No,
this, and
he
I was
no,
like,
he does no, but no, I'm sorry. He does not believe that. I don't know why
right.
he's saying it,
You
but
know
he
why
does
it's
not
saying
believe it.
it, right? But
Right.
does he actually believe that? Because before the war, he was saying, well, the US has no interest in, or Trump specifically, but the US more generally, doesn't have an interest in liberating the people of Iran, only in destroying Iran.
I think that's true.
Well, it might be true in some kind of objective sense, but we can't adopt his great power theory of like nations and
Oh, right.
like
Okay.
there are a lot of assumptions there that are just wrong.
Hmm.
And it's curious because there might be an objective logic that leads Iran to become Gaza.
Right.
There might be an objective logic.
I mean, I think it'd be hard. I think that I don't will never quite become Gaza. It's 93 million people. It has much more of an industrial base. The geography is
It's easy
different.
to like. I posted to Facebook that Trump said that he's not going after infrastructure in Tehran
Hmm.
because it would be too traumatic for the people,
Hmm.
and it would be too devastating. It would involve too much rebuilding. I mean, essentially, they could cut off all the water and all the electricity in Iran immediately,
Yeah, and
and
they
that
haven't
would
done
cause
that.
a massive refugee crisis.
Right, and they don't want to do that. And look, but okay, just from
But they
I've been
can.
thinking about this. I've been thinking about this from the point of view of, if I'm playing a game of Risk or a
Oh
video
damn!
game,
Yeah.
like how does it work out? Like pretending that I have something to say about military strategy, right?
Right. Hmm.
Right. And my feeling is what we talked about. I talked about this with Studebaker. My feeling is that there ultimately they can't simply destroy all the infrastructure of Iraq. I mean, sorry,
Right.
Iran, enough to stop the attacks on the strait. There always be a risk of a drone attack or a fast boat in the strait.
Right. This is part of the discussion. Now, this is part of your discussion with Studebaker that I thought was
Mm,
kind of unfortunate, which is
yeah.
that I thought, okay, he was saying something about like, the number of drones that would need to be produced in order
Mhm.
to, like, you know, be some kind of a, and I think Robert Pape was also saying something similar to this, that you
Yeah.
couldn't reduce the number of drone attacks to zero. And I'm like, well, no water, no electricity. They're not going to be manufacturing any drones, nor are they going to be running them. So it's just, like actually, in fact, and also they're sending in the Marine Expeditionary Force. I mean, I
Hmm.
think it's going to be to seize Karg Island, but it could
Hmm.
be to seize the area around the strait so that you couldn't have missile attacks on ships.
Right.
So, let's just
Well, what they want is to have a show of force. This was the thing I think about NATO,
Mhm.
trying to get NATO nations involved. It was not a matter of actually the firepower; it was a matter of the show of force that would make it politically unfeasible for the strait to be continue to be shut down. That you don't want to be attacking French ships, Japanese ships, Chinese ships, that are securing the area. Um, so that was the aim, I think, of Trump's call to
Yeah.
to to not have to shut down the power or not have to send troops in to duke it out and secure the area, but just to have it be politically impossible or at least too costly to continue to disrupt. I mean, and the other thing, the level of disruption is really not very high. They haven't sunk a tank or anything. They've caused a couple of fires with some drones, and no one wants to send. They can't ensure to send these tankers through when this is going on. So it's just minor incidents will shut it all down. So it's not a matter. So this is why
Well,
asymmetric
the U.S.
warfare.
has promised to insure ships going through the
Yeah,
strait,
I know,
and
but
they
that
can.
hasn't.
They can serve.
They can, but that hasn't quite come together yet. Um, right. So in any case, like I do worry about. Um,
I play devil's advocate for a reason,
yeah.
because I think that the left tells itself stories.
Hmm.
And for instance, a year ago,
Hmm.
right, we're well into the Gaza ceasefire,
Right.
and there was the food delivery controversy, and there were 2 million Gazans on the brink of starvation. Whatever happened to that? Gone. Nobody's talking about that. That didn't happen. Right?
Hmm.
These doomsday scenarios are not going to happen because that's not what the US is doing.
Right.
And I will hold to my point from 2 weeks ago, which is that there are two wars going on. There's an Israeli war and there's an American war, and they're not the same. Now, if you want to know what I think Trump's whole thing is with this, I think that he likes to be in the position of negotiating. And the problem is that he's one side of a two-sided negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Israel factors in, meaning if he can position himself as somehow the mediator between what Israel is trying to accomplish and what Iran is trying to accomplish, that's the place that he's most comfortable in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why there are limited war aims on the part of the United States. And they're limited to the negotiating points. Meaning, I think the negotiations were in good faith. I think that Witkoff, I think the Iranians impressed upon Witkoff that they were unwilling to concede on any of the points. Witkoff went to Trump and said they're not willing to concede on any of the points. And Israel and the CIA and whoever said Khamenei is going to be with his leadership. And so we have an opportunity to wipe them out. And, so let's do this. And, and Israel said, we're going to do it because the U.S. has not been doing that. So it's one of the things that Studebaker was saying, they, as if Israel and the U.S. are the same, as if the U.S. is killing off the leadership. Israel is killing off the leadership. The United States is not. The United States is holding back and saying, we'll negotiate whenever you're ready. We'll call off the Israelis. But in the meantime, the Israelis are just a force of nature decimating. There was another incident, which is that the Israelis destroyed a oil depot processing refinery outside of Tehran and caused this environmental disaster to happen. And the U.S. objected and said, no, do not attack any infrastructure. Right. So there are two different wars going on, in fact. And they're coordinated to a certain degree, but they're also not. And they have different aims. And actually, the fact that Trump allows Israel to have its own war aims, which are regime change. Israel, regime change. U.S., not regime change.
Right.
Which that's the place that Trump wants to be in, which is that the specter of, that Israel is going to attack, that Israel is going to do to Iran what it did to Gaza and Hezbollah, to Hamas and Hezbollah, to southern Lebanon and Gaza. And that they have the ability to do that, in fact. They do. They have the ability to, take an urban society and make it uninhabitable. They do have the ability to do that. And Trump is there saying, we're ready to talk when you are. You could always end this.
Right.
That's what he's doing. And of course, that means that no one knows when it might end. Right? Like that kind of strategic ambiguity. Everything that I wrote about the tariffs applies to this war.
Yeah.
Don't pay attention to the people around Trump. Pay attention only to Trump. Strategic ambiguity is an asset in any negotiation. He's not going to blink. He's not going to blink. He's playing chicken. He's not going to back down. He doesn't have to. He doesn't care about the popularity. He does not care about the political consequences at all. He doesn't care what the Europeans think. Nothing. He cares nothing about that. He's going to just do this.
Well, okay. So I think that I want to go back to the Strait of Hormuz and say, when it comes to securing the strait, and because I do think he does care about the market and about
to an extent. He also said this. He said, we had a great economy, and so now we're going to have a bump in the road for the war, but it's okay. We can take it, and it's worth it. Right. So he does not care about the economic disruption. Now, the Iranians imagine, because they're reading the New York Times. This is the problem. The Iranian leadership are reading the New York Times and the Washington Post. And they're like, oh, Trump's going to back down. Taco. Trump always chickens out. No, this is in other words, the Democrats are leading the Iranians to the slaughter by feeding the world this propaganda that idiots like the Islamic Republic might be liable to believe about Trump. And it's not true, right? So in other words, these third world dictators who are getting their information from the American media about Trump, it's not true. And yet they're going to act on that domestic propaganda lie, and people are going to suffer.
Right. Well, uh, what about Greenland? He seemed to back off of Greenland because
No,
of
no,
the
no.
market.
He got huge concessions, and like I said, the logic of it is that decades from now, Greenland will be part of the United States, and everyone will remember that Trump set it in motion.
Okay, so yeah, I mean the problem here is that on the one side I have a Studebaker interpreting it.
Well, he's anti-Trump.
Right.
It's biased. And look, I'm against the war.
Well, yeah.
But the question is, like, everybody's scratching their heads, why now? Why did he do this? And Israel and whatever. It's clear what happened, which is that they had massive protests that were massacred in a way that had never been the case since the beginning of the Islamic Republic. They never massacred protesters like that. They massacred leftists who were already in prison, political prisoners. But they didn't massacre people like this. And so the idea was, after the war last year, the 12-day war, and in light of everything that happened after October 7th, how like Israel denied the proxies of Iran throughout the region, and also after the U.S. bombed the Houthis last year for some time, and everyone's like, oh, well, that was an abject failure. Well, evidently not. The Houthis are not able to do what they did prior to that anymore. And the fall of Syria.
Right.
These things have changed. Things have changed. And so that situation combined with the protests meant there was this opportunity. Right. Opportunity to do what? So Israel has been arguing for regime change for a long time. But that's not the opportunity that Trump is trying to take advantage of. Meaning, does he care whether, if there's a revolution in Iran and the regime is overthrown, and, some elements of the state get rid of other elements of the state, that's fine. He wants to subjugate Iran to the United States. He doesn't care who rules it, what the government is, Islamic Republic, monarchy. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. Democracy, not democracy, military dictatorship, does not care.
Right.
Does not care. So that's the opportunity. The opportunity is to get people in Iran in a position of power to deal with him.
Right. But that's where he seems to be failing. Because
2.5 weeks in, sure, of course he's failing, because these people are ideological, they're zealots, and they're like, hell no. And, but, in Trump's mind, people can say no all they want, but in the end, they'll submit. Doesn't matter. And also, everyone's acting like he's on a timetable, right? They're on the timetable, not him. Meaning he's got 3 more years in office. He's not going anywhere. He can do this all day.
Right.
They can't, actually.
I do think that taco idea, and the fact that he would be really his one concern is to make sure that the stock market goes up, and that we have high GDP, and that we are economically superior to the Biden administration, and all that kind of thing. That people believe that, and I kind of tended to believe that too.
Generally true, but he is willing to make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. And I mean, look, obviously the tariffs were risky.
Well, right. Yeah, that was the whole idea of the tariffs. There would be short-term sacrifices. How severe they would be could be mitigated, but they would be short-term sacrifices.
They have to deny certain things because it's unpopular. For instance, like Scott Bessent and other people like Kevin Hassett and Stephen Myron, like they've let slip. They have let slip. You have to pay attention that basically the tariffs are a consumption tax in the United States. That they are trying to decrease domestic consumption of cheap products in favor of reindustrialization.
Right.
Now, they can't come out and say, we're doing a consumption tax, because everybody would scream about that. Literally everybody would scream about that.
Yeah.
Rich people, poor people, economists, everybody would scream about that. So they have to sort of, do it. Just do it, right? Because they've literally said the era of deindustrialization and cheap consumption on the part of the working class is a failed economic model, and we're not doing that anymore. Well, guess what? One big element of that is cheap consumption by the working class, meaning they're ending that. They are. I mean, they've told us, right? So that's it, like, and so, obviously what that means is they think that long term the economic model wasn't working and that it was hurting the middle class and the working class anyway. And so the question is, hurting them to what end? They're willing to say, okay, it's not worth the pain to build up China. It is worth the pain to build up the US. And that goes economically, militarily, politically. I think that Trump had suggested raising the military budget by 50%, Doug, before this war. So this is the plan, right? The plan is, they're going to arm the US to the teeth. They're going to achieve strategic dominance, end all these festering things that everyone's like, well, you can't do this and you can't do that, and it's intractable, and the best you can do is the JCPOA. And there are, in a way, there are no limits here, because I was thinking about this. Did you hear about this idea that like Israel was going to nuke Iran?
Yeah.
Okay, so they might, because there's Pickaxe Mountain, right? There's an even deeper facility, Pickaxe Mountain, where the Iranians might, build something that can't be accessed by the bunker busting bombs that the US drops from B-2 stealth bombers. And Israel has a history of unilaterally going after nuclear programs in other countries. They did it in Iraq, they did it in Syria, they did it in the 12-day war in Iran. And the US put the icing on the cake. They might nuke Iran that way, like some limited tactical nuke. And what I was thinking is, the US has actually considered that with respect to North Korea and Libya. So there was some discussion of, to prevent North Korea from getting the bomb, destroying their facilities, and the only way to do it would be a nuclear attack. Libya wasn't a nuclear program, it was a chemical weapons program. And the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, they considered a tactical nuclear strike on Libya, this major threat to world peace, right? They considered it. And it came out later, meaning they didn't announce it. It came out later. And then it's kind of like, holy shit, these people do consider doing these things.
Seems like way overkill to me.
But it's purely technical, meaning, can we reach it with the bombs that we have? No. Could we reach it with a tactical nuke? Yes.
I grew up, during the Cold War, and I recall that you don't always need a nuclear weapon. In fact, if you want to stop a nuclear weapon, what you need is a really good spy, like James Bond. You
And
send some really,
by the way, they have that. Yeah.
You send in some really good spies. They break into the base.
And
they sneak in, they sabotage it, they take it over. Then maybe ground troops come in behind them, and you don't need to blow it up.
That's what I mean, though. So it's purely technical, and what I'm saying is that this is something that they have. They may or may not use it, but they have it, and they consider it. That's all that I'm saying. They consider it.
Right.
And I'm saying this because, which is more likely, that the US is going to be pushed out of the Gulf states, right? And all the military stuff that the US has in the Middle East will be withdrawn, and the US will pay reparations to the Islamic group. No, much more likely Israel will nuke Pickaxe.
No, I mean, look, I don't understand how anyone thinks that that's going to be the outcome here. That we're going to pay reparations.
And who knows? Like, they're either lying, they know better, or they're deluding themselves, right? And I think that also people don't understand how ideological totalitarian dictatorships collapse.
Mm-hmm.
because they do collapse overnight. You know, we're old enough. We witnessed the end of the Cold War. We
Mm-hmm.
witnessed the end of these communist regimes in
Mm-hmm.
Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union,
Right.
and they just fell. Right? They had
Mm-hmm.
huge popular support, huge institutions, huge machineries of power that just vanished. They just vanished.
Right.
And so
Well,
there's no way that the Islamic Republic is more resilient than Eastern European communism. Give me a break.
right. No, I totally agree
You
with that.
know,
I
I
mean,
mean, it's like,
look,
come on. They had like such a secret police. Do you know, like the idea
look,
of
all
the
you have to do is turn this around for a second and imagine that we're at war with, Russia or China. Let's say with China, and our navy is at the bottom of the ocean. All of our airplanes are destroyed, or most of them are. We can't. Our drone making facilities are being bombed. Our missile launchers are declining. We can launch less and less every day, and the someone gets on the internet and says China's losing. We're going to push them out of Taiwan. We're going to push them out of Africa. They're going to pay reparations. They're on the verge of collapse. I mean, come on.
right,
Would anyone believe that if
right,
these things were reversed?
right.
Obviously, obviously, there's something very weird about the way we think about these things, and it has to do with assuming U.S. power, not really denying it. It's like, oh, the U.S. has to maintain a certain level of absolute power, or else
Hmm.
it is losing. And
Oh
and
yeah,
therefore it will, in order to protect what it has, this absolute dominance, it will, back out of things. It will pay reparations. Um, Basically, we'll force them to settle out of court. It's
I
sort of
think
the.
people were convincing themselves the last several years
Mhm,
in the first Trump administration and the Biden era, and already starting under Obama,
mhm,
about the pivot to Asia, bogged down in the Middle East, let Europe take care of its own security concerns. The US has to focus on China now. And somehow the significance of Trump's election was connected to this, that somehow Trump represented this, oh, we should not be anti Russia, we should be anti China kind of idea. And I never bought it, right? And then obviously there's some kind of bipartisan anti-China consensus in the United
mhm,
States. And so the Democrats saying that Trump was in the pocket of Putin and Russia, you know, like just the whole thing, and I think this has been overstated. And I think that Trump doesn't see it that way. Meaning Trump doesn't see some kind of ultimate battle with either Russia or China, nor necessarily with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
no.
Now, the Islamic Republic of Iran might see themselves as in an existential struggle. And I
Mm,
don't know, Duganite Putin, Russia, and maybe some kind of Communist Party elements in China might see themselves as in some kind of like Titanic, world historical Armageddon type final struggle. I don't think the Chinese really see it that way. I don't think the Russians really see it that way. I don't think that
mhm,
Putin sees it that way. And this whole like Tucker Carlson, like the decline of the West, Viktor Orban. I don't even think Viktor Orban sees it that way. I think Viktor
right.
Orban cares about Hungary, you know?
Mhm, mhm.
And but this kind of fantasy that people have elaborated for themselves, and it's just not reality. This is not politics. This is not the way the world works, nor is it the way the world is going to work. And it's just like a
I
story.
remember when all this stuff was, recognizably right wing.
Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilizations.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, at the beginning of the war on terror, that was Huntington in the Clash of Civilizations. That was the rhetoric of the warmongers in the United States and around the world. And
Well,
it
he's
was
a realist, I guess. He's not really a neocon, he's a realist. So it has a little bit of that flavor to it. And he's not like a right wing person. He's like a centrist. He's like, I think that,
Yeah, well, from my perspective as a guy who was
sure,
organizing peace protests,
it's
he
right
was
wing.
it was
It
right
is
wing.
right wing. From a socialist
Yeah,
perspective, it's totally right wing.
yeah,
And it's more or less claptrap. It's more or less ideological.
yeah,
And, and it's just like, do I believe that the world is essentially a clash of civilizations? No, I don't.
yeah. This is what's bothering me, and this is what I'm running up against when I'm on Twitter, wasting my time there, is that I keep trying to tell people the way to critique this is not to say Trump is an idiot. It's not being managed properly. We're
Well, there's
doomed to
that.
lose. We're
Technical.
doomed to lose. And Iran has America by the balls. Once you start saying stuff like that, you're no longer a critic of the war. You're just taking sides in it, right?
Absolutely.
And I said rather so all of that is like right wing. That's a right wing critique of the war, all of it. And what about the way to start? I think would be to look to the people of Iran and then the people of the United States. So what's going to happen to them at the end of this? Who does this serve? And what
Right. So the grand strategy, obviously, Trump does want to end these conflicts in order to, first of all, he wants to make everybody in the Middle East a client of the US. He does want some kind of triangulation, some kind of balancing between Egypt, Iran, the Gulf states, Turkey, Israel. And then in that framework, Israel is totally diminished in importance, by the way. Right. And it's within a larger context. Obviously, Europe is there, and India, Pakistan are there. Russia is there. So the idea that like Iran is an ally of Russia, well, no. Historically, Iran has been an enemy of Russia. Russia's been an enemy of Iran. So there are great opportunities for regional power balancing, and I think that Trump thinks that a combination of blob, incompetence, inertia, neocon folly, liberal human rights interventionism, that this all kind of colluded into this situation where the US was not putting an end to these conflicts or managing them properly, but sort of inadvertently festering them. Like allowing them to grow out of control. And so it's like, dealing with Iran. How do you deal with Iran? You're trying to neutralize Iran. So I mentioned Vali Nasser. He was saying, and there are a bunch of people like this who are commenting on this, commenting that the JCPOA in 10 years would have built up a middle class in Iran that would have ultimately overthrown the Islamic Republic, or at least reformed it. And so the problem is that Trump cut it off before it could work. And, I think that Trump's attitude is, this has never worked. This is like the fantasy of the bureaucracy. Maybe one other thing that I wanted to say about this, because it occurred to me, I had a sort of a moment of like intellectual shock and outrage, which is that I realized that everybody interprets everything through elite theory. Yeah. And meaning, if the Islamic Republic regime is based on 20-25% support, well, that's sufficient because that's your kind of ruling elite. Right. And so if you interpret things in this way, if you understand politics and society in this way, then you look at Iran and you say, well, they have like a coherent ruling class ideology, and they're organized, and they're meant to withstand this. They've been in this fight for 50 years, and they're, motivated by this kind of religious vision. And it's worked. It worked to consolidate something after the Islamic Revolution, and it's worked for all this time, and it will continue to work. Whereas the US has like an elite in disarray, a decadent elite, right? So not a rising, muscular,
Oh my
in its
God.
not in its prime elite like the Islamic Republic, but no,
Yeah.
this decadent elite in the United States. And so they just look at like what's the condition of the Iranian elite versus what's the condition of the American elite. And they just think, of course, America has to lose. And I'm
Totally
like,
crazy. That's totally
but that
crazy.
is the underlying assumption, Doug. That is how people are understanding it, right? And right and left, because after all, maybe the left is just what Burnham says they are. In other words, they're just an aspiring elite,
Well, no, I think that's true
right?
right now. On the ground, objectively, that is
Right.
obviously the fact. Yeah.
And that's the DSA. It's also the ACP, the neo-Stalinists. It's just whoever you're talking about,
Right.
right? That it's Pareto principle, total.
I have a comrade who was telling me that I should support China because if I played my cards right, I could be the next president of the United States.
Well, that's the thing. So people look at China and they're like, China has its act together. China has an elite that's adequate to its conditions, and the U.S. doesn't.
but I mean, you know, if he had tried to sell me the, the Hawthorne Bridge, that would have been more realistic than this talk about China installing me or or anyone that he knew into the
But if you look at the
presidency.
elites and the condition of the elites, I think it's going to be misleading. And meaning,
No, I totally agree. But
you
you
know,
understand. But that's where that kind of thinking
yeah,
goes. Is what I'm
it
saying.
is right. Meaning, and the Sinophiles, the admirers of the China model, our friends like Conrad Hamilton, like they
Mhm.
just, they go to Shanghai, they hang out, and they're like, oh, things work here. They don't work in America.
What does that even mean to them?
Right. They don't understand what works and what doesn't work and what has to work versus what doesn't matter whether it works. And there is poverty in China, and it is basically marginalized, and people are doing whatever.
Mhm.
And so it's very impressionistic and it's very technocratic and it's kind of a
Mhm.
bureaucratic mindset. And so they just look at this kind of shambles, kind of rickety thing, the United States, that's never quite had its act together, truth be told. Never did. Like maybe it came closest during the World War II mobilization, but even
Uh,
then,
Right. Mhm.
there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of like shoddy, like, a war. Was everything built according to spec? Did planes not fall out of the sky because they were rushed off the assembly? Of course they did, right?
Mhm.
And and at the time it looked like the Germans had their act together more than the Americans, and maybe they did.
Mhm.
Maybe the Germans had a more coherent war industry, but that's not what matters. Like in the end, like we are talking about capitalism.
Mhm.
And as much of a mess as the US is, it's this capitalist dynamo. It's this
Right.
thing, and it's not going anywhere. And it can afford to make mistakes. It can afford to do all sorts of things without being fundamentally shaken.
Right. So here's what I want to say also about this is that when it comes to Trump and this strategy, right, that he has, we should think of it. There's nothing to valorize here. There's no reason
No,
to embrace it. This is. I just think of the Godfather movies, right? He made the mullahs an offer they couldn't refuse, and they refused it, and this is what you
that's
get.
what
And
happens. And you just kill,
right,
kill them off until you get someone to say yes.
right, yeah, and
I mean,
that's
but again, that's like he's not himself doing that. That's more like Netanyahu.
right.
That's more like the Israelis, and they have their own understanding of that and what it's about. And Trump again would love to just rise above it and say, I mean, look what he did with Hamas in Israel, in Gaza.
Right. Mhm.
Because again, it's like, oh well, this could never work. It's working.
Mhm.
It is working, right? But nobody's talking about it because, of course, it's working. Therefore, there's nothing to talk about. It can't be used against Trump,
Mhm.
you know, but it's working. And, is it creating a situation that we as socialists like? No,
Mhm.
right? But his attitude was, the Palestinians and the Israelis could kill each other endlessly.
Mhm.
And he's trying to create that scenario with Israel and Iran, meaning they could lob missiles and drones all day. They could just do this forever. Or they could take the deal that Trump has to offer.
Right. I mean, the problem there is that is the strait, unlike in Gaza, there's a chokehold for global capital there.
Yeah, it matters to global capitalism in a way that Gaza didn't.
Right.
But when Trump says we don't need any oil from the Middle East, he means it, meaning the United States doesn't need it. So everyone else needs it.
Yeah.
Meaning that everyone else needs to assert pressure to bring Iran to the negotiating table.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, ultimately, we do need everyone else, right? To have
some level, at least at
Yeah.
some level. Meaning, do you need an armada of international navies? No, you don't need that.
No. I just mean that we need Europe and China and the Gulf states to be productive and relatively successful in
So
order
if
for our
China
own.
has been propping up the Islamic Republic, if it has, which let's say that it has, then of course at a certain point China is going to tell the Islamic Republic, take Trump's deal.
Right.
Meaning, is Iran fighting on its own? No.
Right.
It's not. And it has positioned itself as part of this, global resistance to US empire. But it's one of the pawns that can be sacrificed.
Right. And also the whole thing is like crazy because on the one hand, there's a war between China and Russia and Iran, say in the United States, a Cold War maybe, or now a hot war with Iran. But on the other hand, they're completely interdependent. China doesn't want to bring down the United States economy. Neither does the United States want to bring down the Chinese economy.
No,
right?
Not at all.
Right. So all this is a matter of, okay, look, which one of us can endure this longer? Who's really on the hot seat in the present? And that's all that Trump is saying. He's not saying, oh, we can go it alone forever.
No.
Right.
When he says he doesn't need them in the end, he's also like saying they need us more than we need them.
Right.
The Europeans, the East Asians, because not just China, it's South Korea, it's Japan. And, the other thing about Trump is that did he have like a step-by-step strategy? No. He didn't need one because he is going to evolve the strategy as things happen. And,
well, I think they did have plans for how to secure the strait. And now it's just a matter of which one they want to implement and on what timetable, right? Because I'm sure they didn't go in not knowing that Iran was going to possibly shut down the Strait of Hormuz, right? That was like they weren't
the
blindsided.
U.S. has a lot of plans on the shelf. So that's the other thing that people don't understand is that this military bureaucracy is nothing but planning for eventualities. And certainly before this happened, I mean, the thing about the Democrats, I was watching the Senate testimony, is that they want, the plan to be revealed so that they can pick it apart. And the Trump administration would rather say there is no plan for us to tell you that you can pick apart, right? That doesn't mean that there is no plan, right? So clearly there was a plan, and there are all sorts of contingency plans. And like I said, there is a Marine Expeditionary Force on the way, and also the surprise attack character of it, meaning they did it before all the forces that had already been underway had arrived. So, meaning the Iranians, they wanted to catch the Iranians off guard. The Iranians were like monitoring, like, okay, where are the aircraft carriers and whatever, right? And they attacked before that all the things were in place. So they thought they had more time. It was a surprise attack. And, I guess we're not supposed to, like appreciate that or accept it. We're supposed to say it's illegal and, it's preemptive war and all this stuff.
Well, right. Which it is, but, by the way, technically it is all those things. And unfortunately, we don't live, I mean, this fantasy.
There's no international law.
Right. That we're going to perfect capitalism, impose international law, that the right elites will control this mess, and we can have capitalist utopia. That's what that is, that vision. That's just wrong. And as Marxists, we should know that's wrong. Why are we debating
Yeah.
that, or propagating it,
Because we're trying to, as leftists, I guess the idea is that, we should welcome, I mean, given the atrocities of Trump's policies, the ICE deportations and, killing Americans on the street, we should welcome Trump being taken down by the Iranians. The
Okay,
Iranians
yeah, we should.
are 30
We're at an hour here, but let's just for a moment
Mhm.
talk about revolutionary defeatism,
Okay.
because I think that this is in the background for a lot of what I mean. It's the kind of slogan that people have in the back of their pocket to justify.
Pseudo-Marxist anti-imperialism, yeah.
Yeah. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea of revolutionary defeatism was that in a conflict between two imperial powers, the socialists and the workers in both countries should oppose their own governments.
Mhm.
That's revolutionary defeatism. So you
Mhm.
want both sides to lose. And in a conflict with a colonial nation, you should side with the colonial nation, and the
That's
socialists should.
revolutionary defensism.
Right.
So it'd be
Right.
defensism in Iran and defeatism in America as opposed to mutual defeatism.
Right. But in both cases, the assumption is that you have a socialist movement
Yeah.
of workers
Yeah.
in both countries,
Right.
and that in the anti-colonial struggle, you have socialists who are on the verge of taking over and gaining power in that nation, and certainly that you have some sort of socialist movement within the imperial country, right? And if you don't have that, then rooting for defeat of either side, or it doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't think there's no
Well,
strat.
I think the rationale is that it's like an ethical obligation or something.
Right.
To prove our socialist bona fides, we should be hoping for an American defeat. As Americans, as socialists here, we should be hoping for an American defeat. We should see the benefit of the defeat of any capitalist government policy.
Yeah, but what's the logic there? The logic is that it will teach these American imperialists to be less violent and they won't be adventurous the way they have been. It will rein them in. We'll have a more humane imperialism. And I know this because I said this shit when I
Sure.
was
I
part
used
of the
to
peace
believe this
movement
stuff
in
too.
2003, right?
Yeah. I used
So
to believe it to a certain extent as well. And then, but I think that we talked about this, that I had a sense that the narrative about the Vietnam War was not quite right, like in the 80s.
Mhm.
That it wasn't quite as, I was being told by the progressive liberals, by the anti-Reagan,
Mhm.
and we were being subjected to a certain amount of, revisionism, like right-wing revisionist history. And, do you remember the POW-MIA flags,
Mhm.
how right-wing that was supposedly? And it's like,
Mhm.
well, isn't it about how the US government didn't really care about the soldiers?
Yeah, right.
Right?
Rambo or
Yeah,
First Blood.
Rambo, exactly.
First Blood, right?
Exactly. And it's a strange kind of, we have to sort of remember what that was like. And the idea that there was this Vietnam syndrome. Remember George Herbert Walker Bush said about
Mhm.
the Iraq War, the Gulf War.
The Gulf War, right?
The Gulf War. Said, oh, we kicked that Vietnam syndrome. And it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, but not so fast. And also, how much of a syndrome was there?
And I was pro Vietnam syndrome, right? That was the whole point.
Of course.
Right.
And, so Noam Chomsky, who, has gotten a bad name because of Epstein or whatever,
Mhm.
that, he just pointed out, it's one of the things that I agreed with Chomsky on, because I saw it around me, that the US had actually won in Vietnam.
Mhm.
Because no country would be willing to pay the price that Vietnam paid for its victory. And the reason that I say that is that I heard Central American, Latin American leftists and South African leftists say we do not want to take power because we don't want to be subject to what Vietnam was subject to.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to open ourselves up to that. And so, like, and I think that Reagan avoided those kinds of things. He did these little adventures, and then George Herbert Walker Bush did his snatching of Noriega from Panama.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, by and large, it was proxy wars, and that's what we've been dealing with in the Obama era,
Mm-hmm.
and in the Biden era is proxy wars, meaning
Right.
you get other people to fight,
Yeah.
and you keep the U.S. out, as if everyone doesn't know that it's the U.S.
Right.
Like Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that, the defeatism bit, look, there is bourgeois defeatism. So the All In podcast, and David
Mm-hmm.
Sachs is in the administration.
Mm-hmm.
They had Reza Pahlavi, they had the Shah's son on the previous week. And then last week it was take the off ramp.
Right. I watched that one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's like a fickleness to it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the Pahlavi one, I had seen Pahlavi speak, so I felt like I didn't need to see the All In.
What is David Sachs? Is other than being in the administration, is he some sort of tech bro kind of billionaire or something? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can see why he'd want the off ramp, because this is there's a lot of money at stake in
the war makes no sense economically.
Right.
And and it probably doesn't, but this is politics, not economics.
Right.
And it's just again, what's the overall benefit from Trump's perspective is a Middle East that's not riddled with these conflicts anymore.
Yeah, for a time, like if you think about it in terms of mob boss logic, yeah, you can reign over all the gangs for a time.
For a time.
But
it might even be, there might even be more to it than that, actually, though. Meaning, it could be that these conflicts that we've naturalized in the Middle East, we've naturalized the Middle East as a zone of conflict. Maybe that wasn't quite right. Like, maybe it wasn't inevitable that Lebanon have a civil war. That it maybe these things were not inevitable.
Right.
And some kind of Shia Sunni conflict or Turkey Kurds conflict.
Oh, sure. But don't you think that something else will emerge to create fault lines between capitalist nations to justify conflicts that are rising?
I think so. Yeah, I do think so. I do think so. However, again, these conflicts and the way they've been allowed to fester,
right?
I think that Trump is saying actually not necessarily.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's, I mean, there's a lot going on. There's Afghanistan, Pakistan, there's potentially Pakistan, Iran, there are these potential conflicts that are breaking out and could break out in this context. But I also think that he's got a Nixon Kissinger kind of attitude, Trump, which is to treat these conflicts as failures to manage things properly.
Right.
Right. And I think that the idea of like triangulation and playing people off each other and being sensitive to regional power dynamics and deciding what your priorities are, in a clearer way, and also shedding a lot of the ideological stuff, whether it's democracy or human rights, just sort of putting that aside. What are the actual interests here? What, in contention, and how do you, overcome those conflicts, rather than, the world is on some route to gradual liberalization and democratization, that kind of view. To just say, That would be nice, but we're not necessarily committed to that.
Right.
Right. So I think that that's the kind of thing that is animating the the changes, in the global order. Because
Mm,
that's what we're really talking about. There are changes in the global order that are going on, and
mm.
countries are trying to navigate them, and the US is trying to navigate it. And the US is navigating it not only out of self-interest, but also as the global cop and the linchpin of the global order. So I mean,
Right.
that's where you get into the question of these outlaw states.
Right. I mean, I want to speak again as a wannabe Marxist. You're the last Marxist. I'm a
Uh-huh.
wannabe Marxist. I started out as one, and I'm now returning to be a wannabe Marxist.
Uh-huh.
And say, when people disagree with you about these things, because Studebaker disagrees, right? And I, frankly, I don't know
Yeah.
which one of you guys is really right about this. I tend to think your story is more plausible to me, but because of my sensibility, there's something about Studebaker's that seems a little, like he's got blinders on. He's so
Yeah.
focused on his
Yeah.
particular
Yeah.
definitions that he's not seeing some things. But maybe he's right. But the point for me is this: it's like we're talking about predicting and understanding changes that have nothing to do with that set the foundation or the terms for our efforts, but are not the product of our effort, and that are not
That's
ours.
exactly right. That's exactly
So 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 all of this should be open to debate, and without it should be dispassionate, because there's nothing we're not it's not ours
So
to
we
be.
live through, right here, right now, Jesus Jones watching the world wake up from history.
Mhm.
And like I mentioned before about the collapse of Eastern European regimes.
Right.
It's a totally mixed bag, isn't it? Meaning how these countries have fared afterwards. Some have prospered, some have not. Some have become kind of liberal democratic states, some have become kleptocracy, kind of third world gangster countries.
Mhm.
It's a mixed bag. Now imagine if we are putting ourselves in the position, because this is what leftists do,
Mhm.
of regretting the fall of communism in the East, or alternatively, celebrating it.
Mhm.
Right? So it's like, oh, it was great that Stalinism collapsed in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I'm not going to say that. I'm not. I'm also not going to say I regret it. And really, like, what needed to happen was these Stalinists need to figure out how to stay in power indefinitely, like China
Mhm.
has.
Mhm.
You know, that China solved the problem, and North Korea is hanging on, and Vietnam, right?
Mhm.
And as opposed to the Eastern Europeans and the Soviet Union that didn't have the right policy to like stay in power indefinitely. I can just say what were the conditions under which those regimes were undermined?
Mhm.
How was that likely, probable, predictable in some way? Very kind of coldly.
Mhm.
And then I can say, okay, well, as a socialist, how do I feel? How do I see these things and feel about these things? And that I've completely detached my vision of socialism from the fate of the regimes of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
Right.
You know, which I guess makes me a Western Marxist and a compatible social imperialist and blah 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 blah. And it's like, I was there. I was living. I was there. I had no
Mhm.
power over events whatsoever.
Mhm.
And I thought it was a trap to feel one way or the other about it. It was a trap because it involved shutting down my thinking,
Right.
like just it's like I couldn't really have any hope of understanding what was going on if I felt too passionately one way or the other.
Yeah. And I'll just say this in defense of those who get emotional about these things, which is that, look, the price of gas goes up. You feel insecure. There's bombs dropping. You're the president of your country is saying, I want all the people to come and help us, all the different nations to come help us. The next day he sings, I don't need you. It's a little discombobulating, you know? It does make you feel out of sorts.
You know what it does? It emphasizes to us
Mm-hmm.
that we're not in power at all.
Right.
Nobody representing us is in power.
Right.
Like it's a bitter, like, look, what I'm here to do, I'm not here to like rationalize Trump or be the Trump whisperer or whatever. I'm here to disenchant people of the idea that we have a stake in this, because
Right.
we don't.
Right.
We absolutely do not have a stake in this. Zero stake. We have zero influence, zero power, zero stake.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are passive observers, and we're being manipulated, I guess, for the election later this year and in 2028. You know, narratives are being constructed around Trump and anti-Trump, and you know, is anyone pro-Trump? Nobody's pro-Trump. Like, you can already see it, that everyone will be happy when Trump's gone.
Yeah.
The Republicans will be happy, the Democrats will be happy, you know. And you know, my attitude is, well, that's all well and good, but how are we going to understand what Trump revealed about the
Right.
world? Or are we just going to wake up and pretend it didn't happen? It's like what I was saying about, like, you know, like everyone's going to starve in Gaza last year, and now it just didn't happen, and we forget that we even had that like moment of like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
you know, that the first obligation that I have is to disenchant these ways that people are being manipulated and the stories that people are telling themselves. Like,
Right.
feel good stories, which include feel bad stories, which also make us feel good because it gives a kind of coherence to things.
Right.
That may not be the case, at least not in the ways that we would like to make sense of things. You know, they
Right.
might make sense. You know, like the fact that it is up to Trump. You know, like Tulsi Gabbard, she was asked today,
Mm-hmm.
you know, who decided that it was an imminent threat, and she was like, Trump
Right.
decided it was an imminent threat. And they were like, but isn't it your job as DNI, Director of National Intelligence, to determine whether it's an imminent threat or not? And she's like, no, I can only present the president with the information, and then it's his decision.
Right. Yeah.
You know? And the fact that we know that it's literally one guy, and he's in a position to exercise judgment and make the decision, and that it's always been like that, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And some have been more willing to assert judgment, make a decision, you know, put themselves on the spot and say, yes, it was up to me, as opposed to hiding behind, oh, well, I was told this and that by the bureaucracy, and so I'm not really responsible.
Right.
Would
I
we
mean,
rather
that,
have that?
yeah, I mean, that is a typical way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah.
That's why, you know,
Um,
I still admire Biden for pulling out of Afghanistan,
right.
because he was told, you can't. And he was like, I can and I will. And we're getting out before 20 years anniversary of, you know, the
Right.
invasion of Afghanistan is up. We're getting out. It doesn't matter. Are we prepared to get out? No. We're doing it. Right. And all the experts said, no, we can't. And he's like, no, we are.
Right. And it was kind of a debacle.
And it was a debacle, but you know, how much, you know, really, like, okay, there was a terrorist attack on the way out and people fell out of planes as they pulled. It wasn't that much of a debacle.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, in the, you know, it was a humiliating. Did it look bad? Guess what? You know, because everyone thinks of Trump so like image conscious, and you know, like, he doesn't care. I mean, look at how they've demeaned Trump. Like, he's been publicly humiliated how many times?
Yeah.
He doesn't care. And that's scary. That is scary, right? Is that,
Right.
you know, like his whole thing with the New York Times, like, who do you answer to? And he's like, my own mind.
Right.
You know, and I guess that's terrifying to people, but people need to understand that's the political system we live in.
By the way, that's the whole aim of the Enlightenment.
It's
Is
the
every answer
representative
to their
democracy.
own reason.
Yeah, like
Right.
exactly. And you put this guy in, and at the end of the day, who's responsible for Trump being in office? The Democrats and the Republicans, meaning they were not able to stop him. And so they're responsible, and the political system is responsible in the sense of, is he like the best possible person to be president of the United States? I mean, I feel like as a socialist, I'm not here to say,
Right.
like to
Right.
say, oh, Barack Obama was better person to
Bernie
have,
Sanders would have
or
been better.
Bernie Sanders. I mean, like I have my hostility to Bernie Sanders, but I think he would have been an okay president. I mean, but he probably would have deferred.
Yeah.
I mean, it was never in the cards. I mean, look, like he was never going to be in that position. So that's it. But he would have deferred to the experts, and it probably would have been some Obama Biden type scene, like
Right. Right.
deal. And I feel like, okay, so Trump is coming in, and he's like, watch this, right? And then he's like, does this and that and the other thing, and and some of it works, some of it doesn't work, and but the idea that that he's like personally erratic, and he only cares about his image, and he only listens to the last person he talked to. You know what it is also? I was thinking about this before I got on with you. I'll say this, and because this will lead us into our Habermas discussion in the second half.
Yeah.
Intellectuals, which is what we are, for better or for worse, we're intellectuals. Or anybody like Derek Varn, right? Or Benjamin Studebaker, or One Dime Tony. Like we're all intellectuals. Trump's not for us.
Right.
Trump is never going to make sense to an intellectual.
Right.
Right.
Why?
It's not like ideas, logic, plan of action, execution. Like, in other words, like, no. And what we have to understand is this should be a warning to us, but the world doesn't work that way ever. Like Trump is just underscoring to us, it never works the way intellectuals like to think it works. Ever.
Right.
Right. So in a way, Trump is emphasizing that intellectuals are the least competent.
I have real trouble with this.
It's true, Doug. It's true. The world does not work according to logic. It does not. It does not. It never will, and hopefully we won't need it to. Meaning we overcome capitalism, and then we don't need like the world to operate according to all logic, because we'll have freedom.
All right, we have to talk about this. This is one that I had trouble with, and look, I'm the surrealist of the two of us, right? Why am I the one who wants to hold on to logic?
Aesthetically, in fact,
probably.
no, I won't necessarily claim that for myself, but I feel like I do have. Yeah, I am willing, and also not to turn that into an abdication of consciousness.
Right.
Like not to make it into ego death or some battalion like nonsense or Lacanian whatever. Like no, right? Or no, it doesn't have to be like that. But it's just a basic thing. Like society has a coherence, but it doesn't correspond to a syllogism.
Well, okay, that's different than saying intellectuals, because intellectuals is a broad,
Right. Artists, yes, because they intuit and have judgment and feel and have a sense of like aesthetic form and how things make sense in a more organic way. No, I mean intellectuals in the mind-numbing sense that people are intellectuals. What Adorno called mechanics of the mind.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That intellectuals have been reduced into technicians of their own thinking, right? Where you don't allow yourself to think something just because it doesn't fit a logical formula. And it's like, well, then you're totally useless.
Yeah.
Right?
Let's talk about rationality, Habermas, liberalism, all that in the second half. We've gone pretty long here. And I'll just say at the outset, I know that we did not mend bridges here, or build bridges to people in this one, which I was trying to, but it's going to just be hard. I mean, people
It's going to be
are
hard.
really I'm hearing people who I like and respect and who've been kind of allies talk about the Epstein class and how Israel's manipulating Trump, and how Trump
Yeah.
wanted this to happen in 4 days. And
Talk about intellectual abdication. Like, that's an out, right?
yeah,
Because I feel like actually it's worse than that. Meaning, again,
yeah,
that's another way of producing a coherent narrative that's just a sort of a lullaby story. It's a fairy tale.
right. Yeah, I totally agree. All right, I'm going to end it here, and join us over in the Patreon, the Parrot Room, for the second half on Habermas.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.